Hey there, welcome to the DFSR NFL Bootcamp. That's a lot of letters all at once. My name is James Davis, and I am one of our NFL experts and one of the founders of DFSR. If you're unfamiliar with our work, or if you're new here, we've been in this business since about 2014, trying to pick good NFL players for DFS contests. We also run a full suite of tools for the NBA, NFL, MLB. We offer content for NHL, NASCAR, PGA. We're really a full stack DFS shop, but I would say one of our very biggest specialties is NFL. And that's why this year we wanted to roll out this NFL bootcamp to help you learn what might be the basics to some of you, but I think everyone can learn something from this so that when you walk into this NFL season, you don't come in unaware. In terms of our track record, like I said, we've been helping players win for many years, mostly people playing cash games, 50-50s, double ups, that sort of thing. But you can see on this slide that one of our users did actually happen to apply these principles and our tools to go on and win the DraftKings Million. Yeah, so there aren't that many people that have won it, and at least one of the DraftKings Millions lineups was won by someone coming on our site, locking a couple players, and pressing the calculate button to create lineups using the principles that you'll learn in this video. So hopefully, that may or may not convince you. I'm not sure, but like I said, I think that if you watch this video, you'll get a sense very quickly that there's a lot that you can take away from it. So let's jump into one of the most talked about, but I think one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of DFS, and that's this idea around sample size. Now, sample size is a really useful concept that statisticians have labeled in order to help people understand that you can't just look at a single one-off incident in really anything, but especially in sports, to predict future results, right? So you've heard the idea that past performance doesn't predict future results. Well, the larger our sample size becomes, the more predictive that sample size might be of what's going to happen in the future. The unfortunate thing about the NFL is that with seasons that are only 16 games long, some of these statistics are going to take a really long time to reach what we would consider to be a statistically significant sample size. And so we're left wading through the data that we do have, which is oftentimes incomplete. A lot of times it's sort of comes down to the eyeball test or a hunch or reading into the coach speak leading into the week as to how this wide receiver is going to be used or if this running back is going to get the majority of the carries. And that can be pretty problematic. But I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater. I do still think there are a lot of ideas when it comes to sample size that we want to incorporate and some of the finer points that we want to understand if we're going to be proceeding in a profitable way in DFS in the future. So the first thing I want to bring to light is that we have several different types of statistics when it comes to football. One I would categorize as just sort of a raw numbers statistical stat. That's repetitive, but you get the idea. This would be like Matt Ryan's career completion percentage, right? So Matt Ryan has been pretty much the same quarterback for most of his career, especially as he's sort of reached his prime. You would expect coming into this season with roughly the same personnel on the same team, that his completion rate will look pretty similar to the way that it's looked in the past. And if it were to change dramatically by like 10%, you'd probably figure, they got a new scheme, like he's throwing more deep balls now, maybe he gets injured. But for the most part, he'll very likely be roughly the same quarterback in terms of completion percentage that he's been in the past. But there are a lot of stats that don't bear out this way at all. In our first example here, I talked about Le'Veon Bell scores 4 touchdowns in a game, or James Conner gets 25 carries in his first game. And this highlights the next piece, which is that there are many stats in football that are very useful for us, but mostly come down to your coach deciding that you're going to get that stat or not. And I think running back carries are perhaps the most important stat that we look at that is affected that way. So in this example, I'm saying a bad use of sample size would be to say, hey, Le'Veon Bell scored 4 touchdowns last week, so hey man, he's on a roll, he's going to score 4 more this week. That would be too small a sample size, and that really wouldn't help you. But if last week James Conner was given 25 carries in the Steelers offense in the first game that he replaced Le'Veon Bell, I think you could pretty confidently say, in spite of it being just a 1-game sample size, that the plan would be to make Conner the feature back, right? If he gets 25 carries and the rest of the team gets 2 carries combined, well, you can say pretty confidently, hey, it's a 1-game sample size, but this looks like the Steelers' plan going forward. So in that case, we're happy to grab a 1-game sample size. As we've said many, many times, a 1 game sample size is way more than a no game sample size. And actually, in that case, we were able to predict it well without any sample size of what Connor did, because we had looked to prior seasons and seen that the Steelers had used D'Angelo Williams in essentially that same feature back role when Bell went down. And we were able to apply those same principles, figure it was the same organization, same coaching staff, same, offensive line basically, and say, okay, let's just throw Williams in there and see what happens. And likewise with Connor, when he comes around, even without a solid sample size on him, we were able to deploy him. So that was an example where we could break our rule of wanting bigger sample size and roll him out anyway. I would say a counter to this would be the wide receiver who comes out of nowhere in any given week, right? So I remember a few years ago, there was this guy, Marquez Wilson, right? He was on the Bears, I believe, at the time, or maybe it was the Eagles. This is a good example. But he comes out, he gets 11 targets in a week where the wide receiver one went down, and he was all the hotness in terms of wide receiver punts the next week. He was like $4,500 on FanDuel, and everyone was really, really excited. He had hauled in 9 of those 11 balls and just looked phenomenal. We were a little bit more skeptical about it. And the reason for that is that a lot of times when a wide receiver one goes down, or there's some sort of big shakeup in the passing game, this happens even more oftentimes when the quarterback goes down, all of a sudden the team's plan is just out the window, right? Like if you've been planning to throw to Calvin Johnson all week, and all of a sudden he goes down and it's like Golden Tate and Marvin Jones, the way it's been when Calvin Johnson was still playing, like that's a really fundamental shakeup to the offense. And a lot of times teams are just skating by at that point. Quarterbacks are relying on their reads. They're really not even running plays for anyone in particular in some cases, and they're just getting by. Now with a whole week to practice, that 1 week sample size oftentimes becomes essentially meaningless, and especially in the instance of the quarterback taking over for an injured quarterback, because, it's oftentimes the case that second string quarterback has never even taken reps with the first team, right? So if he just rolls out there and it's like, all right, I guess I'm the quarterback of the Bengals now, he's not going to necessarily have that kind of rapport with the better receivers. So he might just fall back on stuff that's a little bit more comfortable for him. And likewise with quarterbacks, once that new quarterback does come in, we do want to pay very close attention to the following week, because you have to understand something about quarterback and wide receiver relationships to understand how these sample sizes work as well. And that's that not every quarterback is comfortable throwing the same routes as the others, right? So, Tom Brady was phenomenal with Randy Moss. When Matt Castle took over, it wasn't necessarily a surefire thing that he would be able to do the same thing. And I might even have those timelines mixed up, but you get the idea, right? That if a quarterback takes over for someone that wasn't already in there, and they start throwing to different wide receivers, a lot of times it's just because they feel more comfortable with the underneath routes, and those deep balls just don't, feel as compatible for them. The next thing I would say, there are many, many examples of this idea where the coach's plan influences sample size and kind of gives us more flexibility in relying on smaller sample sizes. And I listed it here in the slide too, but it's this idea that that especially with quarterback carries, we really have to distinguish between what's the coach's plan and what sort of sprouted up organically, right? So in the case of Lamar Jackson, he shows up as the starter midway through the season for Baltimore last year. He has 26 carries in his first game. You don't scramble to 26 carries. Like, you show up and that was the plan to give you the carries. Now, speculators at the time may have said, oh, well, that was just his first game. He was just filling in. Who knows if that was just that he had never taken reps with the first team. Like, people didn't know exactly why it was that he had so many carries right away. But we saw over the course of the season, the 2018 season, that was the plan. Just to run first with him if you're up and limit the number of mistakes he can make, since he was a pretty inexperienced passer. Going into the 2019 season, I think we could see that scale back. I mean, running quarterbacks tend not to get 20 carries as part of the plan very often, because quarterbacks are simply too vital to the offense. You can't really plug in a backup in most cases the way you can with, say, a running back. But nonetheless, we could use that small sample size and say, okay, well, this wasn't an accident. On the flip side, say Russell Wilson randomly has an 11 carry week one week when Denver is really getting after him in the pocket, and 8 of those are just scrambles where he goes and rips off a 28 run here and a 21 yard run there. All of a sudden he has 12 carries for 113 yards. And people are like, hey, is running Russ back? Not necessarily, right? And this is where we have to tread really, really carefully with sample sizes. So just to sort of sum this idea up, whenever you're looking at any statistic and trying to determine if that statistic is going to help you look into the past and more accurately predict the future, you have to look into the context. And I know that's annoying. And if you don't want to look into the context, you can always sign up for our tools, because we look into the context and you can be pretty confident that those numbers are informed by only good statistics and good sample sizes. But so things like a hot run on touchdowns, take a close look. It might be that guy's the only option in the red zone right now, right? And if that, given player is going to gobble up 75% of his team's touches inside the 5-yard line, well, that increase in touchdown might actually be sustainable. If it's just a guy who is catching short passes and running 80 yards for touchdowns, that tends not to be a very repeatable skill, right? So as always, look for bigger sample sizes. In the unfortunate case that you're playing NFL DFS and you don't have those bigger sample sizes, just remember, not all stats are created equally, but that doesn't mean we can just give up. So hopefully this gives you guys a better sense of sample size. Certainly if you read our articles or if you check into our tools or hop in our members only chat room, we can go deeper on these points, certainly once the football season kicks off. And we hope you find this useful. You can continue on in the series. We're going to have many of these little highlight videos where, pretty short, pretty quick and to the point, highlighting one little aspect of DFS NFL that will hopefully create, ultimately turning you into a winning player. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.